Good evening. Politics from both sides of the Pacific Rim tonight. But first, here's Ted with a rundown.
What trade do we have to offer our Pacific Rim neighbors, besides our lumber companies? First, Crown Zellerback, and now BC Forest Products. New Zealand-based corporations control a large portion of our forest companies. Coming up, Webster speaks with the Right Honorable Geoffrey Palmer, Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand. But first, yesterday's throne speech outlined the plans for the new Vander Zalm government. But is it just more of the same? That's what the NDP says.
We're a little bit concerned about the amount of right-wing rhetoric and rhetoric about privatization that recalls the 1983 government, rather than a government looking towards the future.
More on the opposition's reaction. Webster asks NDP leader Bob Skelly.
Good evening, Mr. Skelly, but is it not a fact that the right-wing rhetoric will make him a much better target for you and your successor, Mr. Harcourt, when you're attacking this government?
Well, we came into this legislature not looking for targets. We came in looking for a government that had committed itself to cooperation and consultation. What we found, unfortunately, is a government that seems to be harking back to 1983, to that right-wing rhetoric of the Bennett restraint program. And we're a bit disappointed. In fact, we're a great deal disappointed about the right-wing rhetoric and the failure of the Premier right off the top to get involved in a consultative and a cooperative stance.
Well, let's be quite specific about the right-wing rhetoric. I presume you're referring principally to his talk of breaking fresh ground in labor-industrial relations, and also in bringing democracy back to the workplace. Now, what did you read into that, Mr. Skelly?
Well, I don't think that was our main concern, and we don't want to read too much into that. We're hopeful that the First Minister, is serious about this, and that he wants to get together with Labour and with management to talk about how labour relations in the province might be improved, and we definitely need that kind of improvement. What we were concerned about are the statements about getting government off the back of private enterprise, and the typical statements that we heard back in 1983 that heralded a restraint program that did such terrific damage to the economy of the province of British Columbia, damage to our social services, damage to our education system. So that's the kind of right-wing rhetoric that we're concerned about at this point.
So you think we're in for another round of budget cuts, even though he's talking about increased welfare for single mothers and finding funds for anti-abortion and increased welfare for couples, correct?
Well, look, we have absolutely firm support for an increase in funds for people on welfare. It's a shame that in this province of British Columbia, an extremely wealthy province, that people should be forced to live far below the poverty line on welfare. We believe that the welfare rates in this province should be increased. We also believe in some of the statements that were made in the throne speech about increased support for single-parent families, increased support for daycare services and subsidies to people who require daycare. But we're very, very concerned about the fact that Mr. Vander Zalm has tied this support in the throne speech to prevention of abortions or to an anti-abortion stance. So that's the kind of thing we're concerned about in the throne speech. We need much more clarification of Mr. Vander Zalm's intentions before we can give any kind of endorsement to those
All right,
parts of the throne
you're afraid
speech.
of his funding for abortions. You don't think he'll really attack the abortion system, because that's not in his bailiwick anyway. That's a federal law, although he can make the hospitals drag their feet, can't he?
Well, also he can force women who are presented with the choice between abortion or between bringing a child to term, that he can force them into a position where they have very little choice. The NDP's position is that women in the province of British Columbia should have the right to free choice, and that the government should support them whatever choice that they make.
Mm-hmm. And there should be facilities available in all of the hospitals. There's discrimination against people outside the Lower Mainland at the moment.
Absolutely, and that women who, through whatever reason and whatever advisors they choose, arrive at the decision to have an abortion, they should have a supportive surrounding with supportive staff who can assist them in going through that decision, which is a very tough decision for women to make.
Talking about his right-wing business, what did you think of his little elitist touch on the tax-deductible registered saving plans for university? Is that not a bit elitist? And also his credits from grades 8 to 12 for university for the bright stream. Is that not a bit elitist? Do you regret his attitudes on that?
Well, there's no question that the social credit approach to education in this province harkens back to the kind of school system that they have in Britain, where there's a state school system that's starved for funds and the private school system which is indirectly supported by tax concessions and by support from the national government. We're concerned, absolutely concerned, that the government may be moving farther towards the position of supporting elitist schools and starving the public school system for funds. So there's no question that we're concerned about that aspect. Again, we need far more clarification from the Premier on these statements that he's making in the throne speech.
Well, we'll have to wait for the specific bills, but were you not a bit surprised by the appointment of a lawyer, an otherwise fine gentleman, I'm sure, to head the Royal Commission of Education, a criminal lawyer who was involved in the recent major prosecutions on sexual abuse of kids?
Well, I think we have to give the Commission the benefit of the doubt at this point. A lot depends on what Commission counsel is hired and who he hires as staff to assist him, and also what kind of research is done by the Commission. If the Commission does a good job in traveling around the province and meeting with the people involved and talking to parents and students and teachers and faculty, then we'll be quite pleased with that. So it all depends on what kind of work the Commission does. We'd like to see it a broadly based commission that looks into all aspects of the educational system.
Back to his breaking fresh ground, though, is there not an inherent threat there that what he's up to, and I'm speculating, although I know that some Labour leaders would agree with me under the table, that when he talks about bringing democracy back to the workplace, he means kill the closed shop, which would scrap the hiring halls for the construction unions who are in a weakened position.
That's exactly what we're concerned about. We've seen this social credit government before hide that kind of legislation under the rhetoric of democracy and under the rhetoric of equality and equal treatment. We want to see exactly what the Premier means when he talks about democracy in the workplace. Is this just another cover for the right-to-work platform that social credit has wanted to see passed in this province for years, but they've been held back under the Bennett administration by responsible cabinet ministers? Does this mean that the logjam has been broken and that the right-to-workers have triumphed in the social credit party?
No.
We don't know, and we hope that's not the case. But again, the throne speech is not all that specific, but we are concerned about the fact that they couch right-to-work legislation in the rhetoric of democracy.
Well, and the other thing about getting the government off the backs of industry includes privatization. Well, he can't sell the BC ferries. That's just stupid, isn't it?
Well, look, we've heard about the same rhetoric about the government getting off the back of private enterprise from 1981, when Mr. Bennett first became attracted to this kind of rhetoric himself. Since that time, investment in the province has plummeted, the number of jobs in the province has plummeted, the unemployment rate in the province has increased, and we've seen regions of this province reduced to poverty as a result of that kind of rhetoric. What we need, and what we were hoping to see in the throne speech, are some kind of concrete programs to get this province back on its feet, to get the economy going again, to reduce poverty and unemployment, especially among those groups in our society that are the hardest hit.
He's broke. He's $1 billion down this year. He can't wave a magic wand, but do you think he might sell that jewel from the crown of the NDP, ICBC, and let the private insurers, Lord help us, back in again?
Well, selling ICBC isn't going to improve the deficit of the province. It's only going to make our drivers in British Columbia have more difficulty getting car insurance, and it's also going to increase the price of car insurance for the ordinary citizens of British Columbia. That's why we brought ICBC in the first place, to reduce the cost of car insurance and also to make it possible to insure all drivers in the province of BC, so you don't have to worry about being involved in an accident with an uninsured driver.
Sure enough. By the way, do you think this is a total Vander Zalm speech? And does it indicate that he's going to be, as many people suspected, a one-man band?
Well, again, it's very hard to say. When you look at the speeches in the legislature coming from the government side, it sounds like a lot of pats on the back for Mr. Vander Zalm. I think it's very much a one-man throne speech from a one-man government. We were hoping and we were expecting, and Mr. Vander Zalm led us to believe, that this was going to be a far more open government, far more consultative, far more cooperative, and yet the throne speech now leads us to believe that, again, that was just rhetoric, and we have to wait and see what the facts are going to be. But I think our people who expected a more open government have been let down a little bit by this throne
One
speech.
final question. What about Bob Skelly's future after Harcourt replaces you? Will you sit docilely on the back bench, or will you become the elder statesman of the NDP?
Well, I've never been a docile member of the backbench. I've always been active in the debate leaders' roles that I've occupied, whether it was environment, whether it was Indian matters, whether it was forests. I've always been an active member of the legislature, and I intend to do battle in this legislature on behalf of my constituents in Alberni, and I'm going to continue to do that. Look, I've indicated that I'm not going to be contesting the next election. I'll have been around in the legislature at that point for 16 years, and I think politicians sometimes have a tendency to stay around too long, and I don't intend to have that kind of tendency.
Bob, I want you to take some calls tonight. Do you mind?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, phone calls to Bob Skelly, retiring leader of the New Democratic Party, but still the leader of the opposition in Victoria, after the break. Bill Vander Zalm, the Premier, made one nice gesture anyway, Mr. Skelly. He gave you more money for the opposition. Any idea how much you're going to get or what it's for?
Well, we don't have the final figure yet. I guess we'll get an idea when that comes down in the budget on the 19th of March. So we don't have a final figure yet. But there's no question that under the Bennett regime, the opposition had been starved for funds. We had inadequate staffing, inadequate research. And I think it's a good idea that the budget for the opposition, and remember, with the opposition increase in funding, the government caucus also gets a similar increase in funding. So what we're doing is increasing the funding for both sides.
Yeah, but Vander Zalm's a much easier fellow to deal with than Bill Bennett was, I'm sure.
I think Mr. Vander Zalm wants to separate himself from the style of Bill Bennett, which was very much to favor the government caucus and to give all the advantages to the government side. Now, whether he follows through with that practice is a different story, and I think the jury is still out on that one.
Go ahead to Bob Skelly.
Yes, good evening, Mr. Skelly.
Good evening.
I have just one question for you and one comment. I think it's time that the NDP finally started screaming that the emperor really has no clothes. And I wonder what policies you would have brought in to change the outflow of capital. We've got a reduction of 3% in capital investment this year. There was a reduction last year of 6% over the previous year. Here we are in the pre-Expo period, which was supposed to really drive the economy, and it's actually driven it down into the ground.
Absolutely. If you look at the figures that are produced by the Bank of Canada, you'll see that investment in British Columbia has plummeted over the years since Bennett adopted his restraint program. Now, in this throne speech as well, the Socrate government is talking about cutting expenditures and increasing revenues. Well, we simply cannot do that in the province of British Columbia. Any increase in taxes will slow down the economy even further and turn investment away from the province.
Fair enough.
Any cuts in expenditure will reduce the number of jobs and create an additional welfare burden. What we have to do is to expand the economy, get people back to work, and then attract more capital to the province.
Nobody's got that magic wand, Mr. Skelly. We're in a parlous state in British Columbia, and I don't think any government can do very much at the moment.
Well, it seems that Ontario is able to do it by changing around their provincial
Central
economy.
Canada.
It seems that Quebec is able to do it, and it seems that Manitoba, a much smaller economy than ours, is able to turn their economy around.
Well, we're not going to
get
have an
people
economic
working
debate,
again.
but they weren't hit nearly as hard as we were, with a loss of 20-odd thousand jobs in the lumber industry alone in the world recession.
Oh, they certainly were hit as hard as we were. That's Bennett's old rhetoric that BC got it worse than the rest of the world.
Well,
Look,
I've been brainwashed by Bennett. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, Jack and Bob, I'm very concerned about what seems to me to be a total lack of initiative in terms of job creation and actually some actions that I think are counterproductive in terms of getting the economy rolling. Primarily this talk of labor code changes. Nobody knows what's coming down, and all I can see is that as a union person, I'm worried. I don't know what's happening. I'm going to quit spending my money and stick it in a bank because, there's just uncertainty, and I can't see how that kind of uncertainty is going to encourage people to invest. I think investors are just going to sit back and wait to see what happens over the next year, and I think it's the same with consumers, especially union workers, who are going to be scared to spend their money because they don't know whether they're going to have a job from one day to the next.
There may be a major labour confrontation if they kill the closed shops, and nobody can blame me for speculating, because we could speculate. Speculating on right to work is even worse than speculating on the closed shop disappearing.
Well, you're absolutely right. A throne speech that contains nothing more than one-line trial balloons is of no help to anybody. Look, the one thing that's going to attract investment to this province, and also to encourage people to spend their money, people who are currently working and investing and spending in the province, is some certainty as to where we're going in the future.
Fair enough. Go ahead,
If union
please.
members are concerned about their jobs, as the caller says, they're certainly not going to be spending their money.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Skelly, I think you're taking a very shallow look at the new Vander Zalm government, and I think you should be looking deeper than you are right now. And I have one more question. What exactly are you trying to do to get the party back together? It's in total shambles right now, and I just think that you're not doing very much in that way.
Okay, your party's a shambles, and it's all your fault.
Oh, well, let's deal with the first question first, at taking a shallow look at the government. I think if the government had presented a throne speech that dealt with the problems of British Columbia in some depth, then we could analyze it in some depth. If you get a shallow throne speech, then you can only analyze what you're presented with by the government. What we need are some solid, concrete programs that we can analyze in depth, comment upon, encourage or improve upon, and then we can give the people of the province some hope. As to our party being in shambles, let me tell you, my friend, we got 823,000 votes in the last election, the highest number in history. We have 13 brand new, excited, enthusiastic, hardworking, capable members of the legislature. They're going to be the focus and the nucleus of the next government. And I'll tell you something, after the last two elections we had prior to 1986, our party was demoralized. After this one, they're prepared to go for government. And I've never seen our party more together than it currently is after an election.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, Mr. Skelly,
Yes.
on the education thing, do you think there will be more money put into that for special needs? Like, I'm a parent, and I have my son who's 3 enrolled in the Deaf Children's Society.
Mm-hmm.
And the money has been coming to the society, not enough where we have to have some kids on a waiting list. And it seems like, the learning part for a child that's deaf is between 0 and 5.
That's a tough question for Mr. Skelly to answer. You would put in the money, but you don't think Vander Zalm will, do you?
Well, it's very hard to say. And look, there's some of these questions I can't answer until we actually see the budget. And the budget is going to give us a clearer idea as to what the government's priorities are.
Go ahead,
As I
please.
say, we do hope that the government pays more attention to education and puts more money into special needs, but we're going to have to wait till we see the budget and then determine
Fair
the
enough.
government's priorities.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, Mr. Skelly,
Yes, sir.
I've got 2 small points. Unions were badly needed 40 years ago. Right now, I'd like to see right-to-work rules in BC. Another thing, as long as there's an election and you have the union leaders on your platform while you're trying to be elected, you'll never get elected in this province.
Well, let me deal with the second question first. We've had the support of the trade union movement, or at least a large percentage of the trade union movement in the province, for the better part of 30 or 40 years. Our vote over that period has been increasing dramatically. We had maybe 350,000 votes in 1972. We've got 823,000 in 1986. So it doesn't seem that union support has caused us that many problems.
Go ahead.
But on the other hand, I think you say that unions are needed 40 years ago. I think unions are more desperately needed right now. It's well known that unionized organizations are far more productive than non-union organizations. Also, unions protect their members in other ways as well. Occupational health and safety,
Fair enough.
improved pension plans, all of those kind of things. Unions are very important, a very important element in society.
Go ahead,
and government
please.
should recognize
Yes,
that.
Jack.
Yeah.
It's a good thing that Skelly's stepping down because he only got one word vocabulary, rhetoric.
Do you hear that, Bob? Rhetoric. You're accused of endless rhetoric. Thanks for your...
What we need in this province is one word,
What's that?
confidence. Cut out the crepe hangers and let's get confidence into the province and pull together instead of this crying the blues all the time.
Thank you.
Well, the gentleman's right. We need far more confidence in the province. The way to inspire confidence in the province is for the government to demonstrate a little confidence in the province. When the government says it's going to get out of creating employment, it's going to get out of the job of developing the economy, and it's going to leave it up to the private sector, that indicates to me that the government doesn't have any confidence in the economy. What we need is a little confidence on the part of the government, and that will inspire confidence in others.
All he does anyway is whine about Ottawa, isn't it? This new BC Council, the Federal Provincial Council, that's a phony, isn't it?
Well, we've seen councils in the throne speech. We've seen a task force set up in the throne speech. We've seen commissions set up in the throne speech. And I think that people in British Columbia have been demanding action on job creation and economic development and diversification. And in this throne speech, they haven't seen it. As one caller said, 24% of our young people are out of work.
Yeah.
Women are hard hit. Families are hard hit. Regions are hard hit, and all we're saying, not only us in the opposition, but people throughout the province, is where are the concrete programs to deal with these serious problems?
There are none in the budget whatsoever, except to fuel the engines of small business, create cottage industries, get the government off the backs, create confidence by privatization. So it's either his method, and we'll know if it works, or your method of pouring public money into public projects.
No, we're not talking about pouring public money into public projects, and we're more than pleased with the approach to create new small businesses in the province. So we're more than pleased with that aspect. But again, what we want to see and what we expect to see as members of the opposition and representatives of 823,000 people in this province are some concrete programs that are going to deliver the goods for the people
Last
of BC.
call. Go ahead, please.
Hello?
Yeah, it's you.
Yes, right. Mr. Skelly, sorry to see you done so poorly on the election out here. Myself, I just come in from Alberta. I ran for the NDP out there in both the federal and the last provincial elections.
You got beaten.
I see the biggest problem that we have is the fact of our stand on pro-choice. I think for as long as we maintain, an abortion or agree with the abortionists, we're going to always be a second-rate party.
Okay, what do you think of that? There's an NDPer who says he ran federally and provincially who's totally against pro-choice, and you're totally committed to pro-choice.
Well, we're committed to pro-choice. He said we side with the abortionists, and that's not a fact. We don't side with the abortionists. What we say is that it's a woman's right to make that decision herself. The government shouldn't order a woman to have a child if she doesn't want to, or if it affects her health and her standard of living.
Bob, time is up. Thanks very much. You'll be sitting as leader until Harcourt's elected, and thanks for appearing tonight.
Thanks very much, Jack.
Thanks, Bob. I shall be back after the break with Sir Geoffrey Palmer, Deputy Premier, Prime Minister of New Zealand.
One tonight, one tomorrow morning.
I often wonder if it's a phony.
Don't think so.
We're told the Pacific Rim is going to explode.
It is.
It seems quite to explode, doesn't it?
15. 10.
It's just not fair to pick up a cheap phrase and describe one of our Commonwealth partners on the other side of the Pacific with it. Anyway, it's the land of milk and subsidies. It's New Zealand. And with me is Geoffrey Palmer, who is the Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand. And of course, you're a socialist.
Sure.
Your government's been in power since '84.
Yes.
You're going all the socialist extravagancies.
No.
Subsidies for everybody as long as they vote for you.
No, not true. We've cut all the subsidies. We've cut all the agricultural subsidies. We've cut most of the manufacturing subsidies. We got to the point in our economy where we just couldn't afford to go on doing that, and we've cut them, chopped them to the bone, and reduced the government deficit by half.
In a matter of a couple of years?
Yes.
Well, tell me, what about your social safety net? You're a socialist country. Do you have, as we almost have, a complete social safety net in terms of Medicare from cradle to grave, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
We've got free public hospital treatment. We've got subsidised treatment by the doctors. We've got free dental treatment for kids. We have free education. We've got very cheap university education. But we found in recent years that the cost of our welfare state's getting too high, and we're now beginning to look at it in terms of targeting. What we're saying is, instead of paying a pension to everyone, regardless of whether they need it, we've got to have a look at the question of needs, because the New Zealand welfare state has been so comprehensive and so universal that the costs of it are so high that we have been re-examining it from the point of view of priorities.
You're suggesting that there should be a means test for everyone in receipt of a pension and not an automatic payment?
We're looking at the question of targeting. We're not saying that automatically we should go away from what we have at all, but we've set up a Royal Commission on Social Policy to re-examine how the welfare state should work in the 80s, because our welfare state was set up in the 30s, and it's been going on ever since without very many major changes.
You don't sound like a very left-wing socialist government to me. Your Prime Minister, David Lange.
Yes.
Lange. Sounds like you're pretty right-wing.
No, I wouldn't say that at all. What we have said in our economic policies is if we're going to redistribute wealth, you have to have some. And the New Zealand rate of economic growth has been so low and the effective government intervention so bad that we had to try some orthodox economic policies. Orthodox economic policies haven't been tried in New Zealand in living memory. We are trying them.
How about the EEC? Didn't they crack down on your beef and your lamb?
They've hurt us a lot because we used to send all our exportable pastoral products to Britain, and we had a guaranteed market. We didn't have to work at the marketing of it. But now, of course, we have to, because Britain has gone into the EEC, so our butter, our lamb and all our produce is in great difficulty in Europe, but we've diversified effectively. The very things that are happening, such as New Zealand forestry companies investing in British Columbia, is one example of our diversification.
Oh, did old Fletcher Challenge?
Sure.
$600 million.
Yes.
So they made lots of money in New Zealand, and very properly they put it into a couple of big companies here.
Yes.
Do you approve of that?
I
or
do.
Is that capital leaving New Zealand?
No, it's a very good thing for New Zealand because it gives us, our forestry industry in New Zealand, a whole lot of international expertise that it didn't have by having access to all the information that these Canadian companies have got.
Well, now, one of our big union leaders, a mouthy fella called Monroe, of the woodworkers, was very upset at this, and he regards this multinational New Zealand crowd as people we're going to have to be careful, because your conditions in New Zealand aren't as good for your workers as are here when they're working.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that. I think that our working conditions are pretty good in New Zealand. New Zealand's a country of 3.2 million people. We don't threaten anyone. We're not the sort of great big ogre. We're just a small country trying to make an honest living.
What about unemployment?
Unemployment's 4.5%. It's too high. But
that's no unemployment, 4.5%.
Well, it's too high by our standards. We believe it's very important to have a policy of full employment. That's a very important part of our Labor government's policy. We don't regard 4.5% as satisfactory at all.
Matter of fact, you cannot say you're a modest little country sitting quietly in the Pacific when I think, first of all, of what you did to the French intelligence agents who blew up the Rainbow Warrior.
Well, they committed an act of war in New Zealand, you know. What they did was contrary to international law, it was contrary to New Zealand law, it was an outrage, and we don't think that international terrorism should be countenanced by anyone.
Oh no, congratulations, pat in the back, but you also cocked a snoot at somebody else, and you said, no nuclear weapons, go away.
Sure, we did say that, and we continue to say that, and it doesn't matter what anyone does, we will go on saying it, because that was a policy we were elected on. I think people got to understand that in our part of the South Pacific, there's been a serious problem for many years with the French testing bombs at the Mururoa Atoll. And that's had a big effect on public opinion. People do not like nuclear weapons. There is no threat to New Zealand security. The only prospect is that of nuclear war, and that's a prospect that frightens New Zealanders. And we want to say that in New Zealand, we don't want nuclear weapons. That's all we've said. We don't want to upset anyone. We want to be friends with the United States.
And you will remain part of the alliance and all the rest of it.
We've said that we want to, but the Americans have said that they don't regard our policy as compatible with it. So we parted on very friendly terms with the Americans.
Well, we've got the same kind of problem just now with cruise missiles being tested over Canadian territory, but of course we're in bed with the elephant. We don't have much choice. You know, when the elephant walks around, it tramples all the grass. I think it's what they say. Now, domestically in New Zealand, you say only 4-point-something unemployment?
Yes.
I'm looking for troubles. You must have Aboriginal troubles with the Maoris.
We've got the Maori people in New Zealand. We've got a number of Maori radicals who say that things are not good, and there are problems with the Maori community. The rate of imprisonment among Maoris is too high. The rate of unemployment among Maoris is too high. There is an extent of economic deprivation in the Maori community, which the government is working to try and redress. It's not an easy problem, but I will point out to you that historically, the Maoris in New Zealand have a great deal of land, and they have a lot of resources and a lot of pride, and there's been a very considerable change in recent years. What's happened in New Zealand in recent years is that there's been a revival of the Maori culture, a revival of the Maori language, and a revival of things Maori, which is perhaps the only thing that's unique about New Zealand is the Maori culture.
And just while you're on the subject, though, but do they have title to their Aboriginal land?
Yes, they do. There's a whole separate system of title called Maori land.
You didn't steal it in the first place like we did.
Well, we stole some, but they were left with a great deal. And that Maori land is protected under statute, and it can't be sold without the permission of the Maori Land Court.
Now, tourism's big now, isn't it?
Tourism is one of our biggest growth industries.
I've been there. You
Come
know.
again.
I've seen all the sheep in the public parks with the portable wire fences, you know.
Yes.
I've seen all the boys and girls in uniform going to school.
Yes.
That was in 1968. That was like going back to the 1930s.
Well, it's still a bit like that.
Delightful.
It's still the same.
Just
It's a very
delightful.
ordered, peaceful society in New Zealand, and it's heavily dependent on a number of agricultural products, especially sheep. We've got, 60 or 70 million sheep in New Zealand. And one of the things about Canada, though, that's very important to New Zealand is that we need closer relations with the Canadians. The Canadians increased in number 38% last year in the numbers that they visited New Zealand. They're some of our fastest growing tourist traffic is from Canada.
I understand that golf is only about 10 New Zealand dollars a round.
Yes, that's true. I play a lot of golf. In Christchurch, my home city, there are about 10 golf courses. You pay $5 or $10 for a round of golf, and you can play all the year round because it doesn't snow. And
Do you know how much it is in Hawaii?
No, I don't.
In the Nobby courses, $75 American a round.
Well, we should charter planes to go down to New Zealand to play golf, because I tell you, there are hundreds of golf courses in New Zealand, and all I want to say to Canadians is I hope you come.
I see you're going to make one bad mistake if you haven't already done it. You're going to bring in a Bill of Rights which follows in some way the Canadian Charter.
I'm certainly trying to do that. I'm the Minister of Justice in New Zealand, and
in that case, you must be a lawyer.
I am a lawyer.
In that case, you're looking forward to creating a huge, endless money pot for lawyers.
No, that's not what I want to do. In New Zealand, we've got a problem. We've got no upper house. We've got no written constitution.
Lucky.
We've got no federal system.
Lucky.
All we've got is 95 MPs who can do anything. Now, they need some restraint. And a Bill of Rights provides
Do you
it.
want to make politically appointed judges the restraining factor?
Well, we don't want to have judges appointed politically. We don't appoint them politically now. I, as the Attorney General, appoint all the judges, and I don't take those appointments to Cabinet. I make them on the basis of who the best lawyers in the profession are.
As the Attorney General, are you in the Cabinet?
Yes.
You're in the Cabinet. And you've got no upper house?
No upper house.
Well, you know, I don't know if your experience, wisdom, or knowledge, but from the experience I've had in Canada, let me tell you, the Charter of Rights is a snare and a delusion, and handles the whole interpretation of the laws into judges.
Sure, but
which is dangerous.
The interpretation of the law has always been in the hands of judges.
No, I'm talking about the Constitution.
Yes, but the interpretation of any law must be a judicial function. The interpretation of any statute that Parliament passes is done by the judges, here as it is at home.
A court enters a bog of legislative decision-making and assuming to enshrine any particular theory which has not been plainly expressed in the Constitution. That's the danger.
Well, there's a danger in it, I admit, but I don't think you should throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think you do need to have checks and balances, and I think courts are to be trusted to exercise checks and balances in a responsible way.
Far be it from me not to suggest that our courts are not trusted, but I'd rather have a system where if the government does wrong, throw the rascals out and write a new law.
Yeah, that's all very well, but elections are very general things. Elections are on the basis of every few years you judge the whole government on all its performance. A case under the Charter of Rights involves a particular law at a particular time and a particular application of it. You get more justice that way than you do on the general basis of general elections.
I admit defeat. Your calls to Geoffrey Palmer, Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand, one of the most beautiful countries in the whole wide world. After the break. Geoffrey Parker is Deputy Prime Minister. When's your election of New Zealand? When's your election?
September this year, we'll have an election.
You slipping in the polls?
Well, we have been slipping a bit, but we've had a constant lead throughout on the polls ever since our election.
You've really got the pure type of British parliamentary democracy.
Yeah.
Without a House of Lords.
No House of Lords. A stripped version of the Westminster model, pretty close to the House of Commons.
Question, hypothetical question only. If, for instance, your Prime Minister suddenly wasn't there, do you pick him at a party convention?
No. No.
How do you pick him?
We pick him with the MPs of the party in the party room having a vote. Nobody in our political system could become the party leader by being outside the Parliament. It isn't possible. In fact, isn't possible under the law. You've got to be a minister. You've got to be a member of Parliament. But here there's a system that I understand where they pick them outside and then they get a seat. You couldn't do that.
Well, we did it with Turner and we did it with Vander Zalm, and I regard it. I won't tell you how I regard it. Go ahead to the Deputy Prime Minister.
Good evening. I'd first like to congratulate the New Zealand government on their sane policy with regard to nuclear weapons. But I'm wondering how easy it is for Canadians to attend university there and exactly how expensive it would be.
Well, I think that the attendance at my own daughter enrolled last week at university, and it cost her $175 to do that for all the subjects she was taking, but she had got a bursary from the New Zealand government that picked up part of the fees. I would have thought probably, I don't know what we charge overseas students, I can't give it to you off the top of my head, but I would think that if you went down there to go to university, you'd probably $3,000 or $4,000. It would include your living expenses and your fees would see it through all right.
For a year?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. 3,000 or 4,000. How much is a New Zealand dollar compared to ours?
About 70 cents, I think.
70 cents of ours?
Yes.
You're below us?
Yes.
Ours is low enough, God knows. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thanks very much, Jack. I was just wondering, asking the Deputy Minister there, I wonder what it would be like in regards to retirement and why it is that you won't take anybody over 45 years of age.
Well, we have an immigration policy which is reasonably careful so that we don't want to increase our own rate of unemployment. We're particularly careful to make sure that we don't want the unemployment to get up, and so we take people on an occupational list of occupations we need, and we think if they're too old we won't get so many working years out of them. In addition to that, we take people with funds who want to start up in business, but we have a policy which is non-discriminatory as to origin. If you meet the occupational criteria or the business criteria, it doesn't matter where you come from.
If you've got enough money, you can go there and retire.
Yes, you could.
If you have enough money. Thank you. Go ahead from Victoria.
Hi, Jack.
Yeah.
I wish to compliment Mr. Palmer on some of their policies over there. Particularly, I think, in a lot of countries, including right here, a lot of people are getting pensions and whatnot that don't really need them. And if they were cut out, there would be more money left for the people who do need them.
Well, I think that you have to have a balance in these things. We don't want to get rid of the welfare state. I didn't want to suggest that in what I said. What I was suggesting is that we retarget its objectives so it meets the needs of today and not the needs of some years ago. I think it's very important for a nation to have an adequate welfare state for those who can't fend for themselves.
Good enough. But you've decided to cut your coat according to your cloth.
That's right.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'd like to ask Mr. Palmer a question. We just returned from New Zealand, and I know you're encouraging Canadians to visit there, and it's a beautiful country indeed, but I'd like to caution a lot of people to be careful that they make arrangements, because your tourism facilities really don't seem to be in place the way they should, and I found that the price of car rentals, the price of tours, just about everything seemed to be outrageously priced. Not only that, but the people in New Zealand end up paying 2 or 3 times the price of anywhere like in Australia or over here for the price of a car, and I'd like to know what your opinion is about that.
Well, they do. The reason why car rentals are expensive in New Zealand is because vehicles are expensive in New Zealand, and 60% of the price of a vehicle in New Zealand, or about that, is in tax. And that is one reason why cars are expensive and why car rentals are expensive. And I think that we're going through a process of rationalisation in our car industry, but we've had a very odd car industry for many years where they have brought cars into New Zealand completely knocked down and reassembled them in New Zealand using local labour to reassemble them. That's very expensive, and that's the cause of the problem.
That was done as a job maker, was it?
Yeah, it was.
And you said 60% of the price of a car is taxed to the government.
Terrific amount of tax in the price of a car in New Zealand.
Was there one time you had to sell a car before you could buy another one?
Yes, there used to be a time when you couldn't import a car very easily, but all those things are changing. They've been changing very rapidly, but what the gentleman says is true, that it is more expensive because of the price of the vehicle.
You have good public transportation?
Yes, we have pretty reasonable public transportation. There's a very good bus system going around for tourists and tour operators.
Go ahead, please.
I wanted to ask if this was the same government that, on the one hand, handled the American nuclear arms situation was very steadfast about their position, and on the other hand allowed French terrorists to take the life of a Greenpeace person, and then bent to French government pressure to allow them to spend their time, their penal time, on a resort island.
Well, that's quite inaccurate. We didn't bend to French pressure. We had a very big dispute with the French government. We submitted it to arbitration to the Secretary-General of the United Nations. The Secretary-General of the United Nations said that France had broken international law, that they should pay reparations to the New Zealand government, and they did, and that the agents who had been convicted should be sent to a military installation of the French, Hao, which is far from being a pleasant place to be, is a remote atoll in which there were very few facilities, where they had to remain for 3 years. That's what happened. So to describe that as bending to the French government's will is quite wrong.
Fair enough. Go ahead from Galliano.
Yeah, I would like to ask you, Mr. Palmer, if you have the same belittling of the elite that we seem to have developed in Canada. If you'd listened to Jack's previous guest, you would have heard them saying elitism is a bad thing. It used to be that the elite were the things that we should encourage, and I wonder if it's something peculiar to Canada, or whether you also in your society look down upon the elite.
Well, I don't think
that's a difficult question for you to answer, because I was prodding Bob Skelly to see if he'd come back on it.
I think all I can say about that is that I don't know of a society in the world that is more egalitarian than New Zealand.
More with Geoffrey Palmer, Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand, after the break. Geoffrey Palmer is the Deputy Prime Minister of the Labour Government of New Zealand. Now, compare it to the British Labour Government.
Quite different, really. We own the social democratic movement of Britain as within our party, not as it is in Britain in the alliance. It's not split. And we're not as dominated by the trade union movement as the British Labour Party is. But we have many things in common with them. But we have adopted an economic policy which I think is rather different than Labour governments traditionally have. But you'll find in Australia they've done much the same thing.
Yeah. Who's in power in Australia?
Bob Hawke.
That's Labour?
Yes.
Yeah, of course. Should know that. See the ignorance on this side of the Pacific Rim? Go ahead, please.
Hi, to your guest, Mr. Palmer, I would like to know about your immigration policy. Do you have any quota system, or do you have any restrictions at all apart from over age 45? Can anybody apply?
We have no quota, but we have a lot of restrictions. We apply a very strict immigration policy because of the problems with both our social welfare system and unemployment. We have always taken the view that we have, as I said before, people with particular occupations. Skills that we need.
You are very picky.
Yes, we are very picky.
You're not, if you turn up off here, 150 of you in a lifeboat, we'll let you in.
Well, we take refugees. We've had about 800 refugees each year from the Vietnamese.
That's not bad. You're a small country.
Yes, that's right.
You've only got 3 million people.
Yes.
Didn't realise you were so tiny in population. Go ahead from Castlegar.
Yes, good evening, Jack. I'd like to talk to Mr. Palmer, please.
Uh-huh.
I would just like...
Go on, that's you.
Like to say that I was in New Zealand, and it's expensive to get there, but the country is very cheap to live in, and it's a beautiful country, and I think they do swell over there.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that. All we want to do is see more Canadians go there, because the increase in Canadian tourists has been so great, and Canadians are such pleasant people to deal with from our point of view. They are not pushy, and they are very polite.
Good. Well, most of us. Go ahead, please. Where are you?
Good evening, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Palmer. I spent 8 happy years in Auckland, New Zealand. And the question I would like to say to Mr. Palmer is, how come that the hotels and the pubs that's open here till 2 o'clock in the morning, but that tourism was down at 10 o'clock?
Oh, your pubs close at 10 o'clock?
Yes, they do, but if you're a guest in the hotel, you can get a drink much past that time. We've had a review of our licensing laws that's just been given to the Parliament in the last couple of months, and that review shows that we ought to change our licensing laws, and I think the direction of the changes that are recommended would be much what your correspondent suggests they should be.
You don't have the old bona fide traveller thing, do you?
Oh, no, it's not quite that bad, but it's pretty restrictive.
Go ahead, please, from Burns Lake.
Hello, yes, I'm wondering if your policy is the same as the Australian policy where anybody under, or should I say over 25 is ineligible unless they have X amount of money.
No, we just explained that.
No.
It's
occupation.
Occupational skills.
Yes.
Also, I'd like to know what occupations are the most in demand in your view.
Well, I know we have a list of them that the Immigration Division of the Labor Department puts out from time to time, and for example, nurses. We want nurses. We'd like a whole lot of occupations of that sort. They're usually skilled occupations where we haven't got enough of them.
Yeah, are your pay rates comparable? Are they good?
I think our pay rates are probably a little lower than they are in Canada for most occupations.
The cost of living is cheaper?
Yes, to some extent.
Look, one thing before I take another call. What about all this Pacific Rim jazz?
Well, I think it's pretty
important.
important.
Make me enthusiastic about it. You're here for the Pacific Rim Opportunities
Yeah, that's
Conference.
true, and I think you ought to be enthusiastic about it because I think that Canada is a Pacific Rim country and never wakes up to that fact, if I can say that without being impolite. You've got a very big Pacific coastline and you tend to look to Atlantic and the Atlantic seaboard into Europe, whereas you are a Pacific country and your influence in the Pacific could be much greater. And we would like you to play a bigger part in the life of the Pacific. You give about $7.6 million worth of aid to the Pacific Island nations of the Southwest Pacific, and that's very, very welcome indeed. But Australia and New Zealand both would like to see more Canadian influence in the Pacific from a Pacific country, and the business opportunities in the Pacific Rim must be particularly important in a place like British Columbia.
My quotes, the Japanese are busy cutting our throat in coal exports and using the Australians, and I think it's the Peruvians, to squeeze us.
Yes.
You got to watch that in
Well,
Pacific
sure
trade.
you do, but the Japanese are New Zealand's biggest trading partner.
Biggest trading?
Biggest.
Not Australia?
No.
And that's mostly in meat?
It's in a whole lot of agricultural products and iron, sand, and all sorts of things.
Go ahead, please. What are you?
Good evening.
Good evening.
Hi, Mr. Palmer. I would just like to say right on and bravo to you and your government for standing up to the Americans. I really admire what you've done, and I wish that Canada had the balls to do the same thing. And Jack, I really resent your attitude and your remark that we sleep with the elephant. Perhaps you perceive Canada as a mouse, Jack, but I think that if a country of 3.4 million people can stand up to the U.S. in regards to nuclear weapons, there's no excuse for us to be testing cruise missiles.
I don't know why you should resent my remark. It's accurate, politically accurate, every which way.
Yeah, but,
I'm not saying I like it, I just said that's a fact. Go ahead from Sandspit on the Queen Charlotte's.
Hello, Jack.
Yes.
Gee, it's hard getting through to you guys down there.
Well, you're through now, so speak up.
I want to say hello to Jeff and welcome to Canada. This is a Kiwi living up in the Charlotte.
Oh, great.
It's nice to talk to you, to hear about home. One thing, I always get a letter from Mum every week. It only takes 5 days for mail to come up here from home. And she says that with the Maori culture, they're doing a lot now in the schools. I know when I went to school, we weren't taught the Maori language. I'm a Maori myself, and I'm very proud of it. And it's nice to see, that you're finally doing something about it.
It's a very interesting thing. Politics has changed a lot. I have to be able to sing a Maori waiata when I go to functions, and I have to be able to make a Maori greeting, and all the politicians have been taking lessons in Maori. And it's one of the interesting features of New Zealand, perhaps since you've left, of the very great revival that there's been in Maori culture.
My grateful thanks to Geoffrey Palmer, Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand, here for the Pacific Rim Opportunities Conference, and I shall be back after the break. Tomorrow I'm going to be dealing with another potential crisis in the waterfront with Don Garcia of the International Longshoremen's Union and Henry Kanks of the Grain Workers Union. This is the business of the Grain Transportation Act, which apparently is going to subsidize our exports on American lines to American ports. Crazy. At 5 p.m. precisely.